I saw 3 young horses grazing in the dappled sunlight beneath an ancient copse. Behind them, framed by the lower branches of the trees, were the rolling hills of the English countryside, vivid in the noonday sun. What did I recognize in these young horses? I saw creatures of vigor and spirit, domesticated for sure, contained within a paddock, but elegant and poised. Dignified creatures, unlike the anxious, bloated captives of the human domain. And I thought to myself, what if these horses turned runaway? What if the moment arrived and the enclosure was breached, just for a second? Would they make it to those hills? The luscious greens tempered, for now, by the distance. Of course, livestock of this kind is a luxury. These companions, which retain much of their wild beauty, are kept at no small expense. For the masters, the nobility of the animals is both a mark of status and a source of enchantment. Unlike their cousins in factory farms, these creatures are spared the worst excesses of the industrial society and the attendant forms of technological slavery upon which the structure is predicated. There exists a moral unity between master and horse, which most of us can only dream of today. Observing the horses for some time, I considered the problem discussed in the first installment of this series. Allow me to reiterate it here. We are ruled by professional traitors. The political formula employed by these managerial oligarchs implies the systematic destruction of the people they pretend to serve. Until a more compliant replacement can be created, perhaps a mindless, artificial construct, we will be forced to advance this dreadful process. The scope of the project is total. To fight ensures destruction. To flee is impossible. To freeze is simply to wait your turn. The process is obviously unsustainable and wildly unpopular, and yet a humiliating passivity afflicts basically everyone in the West today, even those who can see quite clearly what is underway. Almost all of us are thoroughly domesticated. This alone is not a critical concern. Hierarchy is perennial, and it is incumbent upon the ruling class to enforce certain standards of behaviour. These may be more or less restrictive, depending upon the circumstances within which the social organisation is conceived. Thus our judgment must be about the character of such an arrangement, not the fact of its existence. There are good regimes and bad regimes, but a regime there always is. The performance of ours speaks for itself. This term is nuanced. Even within the regime, there exists interfactional conflict, and conflict between levels. These conflicts wax and wane. There are cycles and epicycles of integration within the complex of subsystems. Some groups are better adapted to the implementation of this process, and are thus overrepresented in the upper echelons of the power structure. Some are clients and some are victims. Some are both. But there remain deep themes which manifest themselves with sufficient frequency that a broad picture may be drawn. These themes originate in the metaphysical domain, prior to any particular ethnic concerns, although the effects are represented with absolute clarity on this level. We seek to change it. It seeks to erase us. History suggests that eventually it will be disposed of, as all previous empires have fallen. We hope to survive the turmoil and welcome a new dawn. Behind the tedious rhetoric about sustainable development, inclusion, equality, and diversity stands a necrotic oligarchy, devoid of any higher principle, and maintained primarily through the spiritual torture of its subjects and the asphyxiation of the Earth's spontaneous ecology. From the perspective of the technocrats, development means the implementation of manual control over natural systems which predate the birth of the industrial society by billions of years. Sustainability is merely the process by which the structure itself is sustained. To the managerial system, we are nothing more than human resources. We are to be harvested, expended, or burned as fuel. The pursuit of inclusion means that no human biocapital may exist outside of this system. Equality prevents unauthorized differentiation from emerging within. Diversity breaks down unique spontaneous social structures, which impede the implementation of technocratic equivalency. These mercantile masters of quantity are not bound to us, either spiritually or existentially. They call no particular territory home. They call no particular people their brothers. They will raze every square inch of the earth, piece by piece, and then move on, like a plague. The devastation means nothing to them. Capricious nature, in all its beauty and ferocity, represents an existential threat to the system of technical management. All unmanaged events exist outside of the domain of technocratic control, and are thus deemed illegitimate. To the managers, the unpredictability of nature is a problem to be solved. Wherever it is encountered, the dynamic and spontaneous realm of quality must be reduced to a state of managed equality. The ineffable must be banished. All distinctions must become quantitative and thus properly adapted for technocratic oversight. The unique must be standardized, broken down, quantified, managed, and controlled. The world may not breathe unaided. The world may not breathe without permission. Thus the tragic plight of Western man. Ambitious, spontaneous, and gifted in the technical arts, he created the foundation upon which the system rests. But the age of the machine has spawned a new kind of man, totally reliant upon its architecture. Physically and spiritually weak, but vindictive and cunning. A type who would be cast out in the pre-technical West. He is at the controls now, and he has turned the machine against its original creators. At all costs, he must suppress the organic realm or face annihilation. He must shackle his progenitors and make of them automatons, servants to a process of ethnic auto-erasure and spiritual dissolution. His is a kingdom of indistinguishable, deracinated producer-consumers, dead of spirit, shunted from one empty task to another at the whim of the machine. A world drained of spontaneity, beauty, and meaning. A world formed around a single master quantity, the pursuit of which overwhelms all other considerations. GDP, CO2, GPU, it matters little in the final analysis. What is desired is the optimum stasis, the frozen world of the managerial technocrat. Our wild ancestors foraged and hunted wild game. We are weaned on industrial chemicals. Our civilized ancestors worked the land. We are fed the processed remains of creatures subjected to the most abominable outrages of husbandry ever conceived. This is not a gilded age of social harmony, as we are told. We have not overcome the regressive themes of the past, and arrived at the end of history. You are what you eat, and slaves eat slaves' meat. The technocratic process requires the standardization of the species. Below the level of the elite, who seek to augment themselves, the masses are methodically arranged into production-consumption templates, as the schedule requires. The children of the templates are grotesque specimens. They endure pitiable lives of indentured suffering. All biomass, especially the most wretched and helpless, is recruited and directed towards the management of the master quantity. Through this process, the consumptive aspect of the economic system is emphasized. This, ultimately, is how the managers hold power. They are legitimized on the basis of their ability to service the dependency they create. Production is required to fulfill the obligations of mass dependency, but productive individuals, by virtue of their capacity, are a source of potential rivalry. The native stock, insofar as it retains the embers of its primordial vigor, could thrive in a different world, one devoid of managers. It is thus imperative that Western men are forbidden from creating independent social structures, or acquiring aspirations which exceed the boundaries of rank materialism. With the mind restrained, the body is more easily absorbed. The mental horizons of our people are limited accordingly. Authorized cultural output is synthesized from three elements: consumer fervor, rote self-denouncement, and xeno-worship. The entire catabolic scheme is monitored by dysgenic HR apparatchiks. We are prevented from aggregating wealth or energy via harsh economic discipline, massive propaganda, and the widespread availability of tranquilizers. Many end up demoralized or seduced into corruption and dependency. Others are simply overlooked in favor of regime clients. This tension is at the heart of the escalating competence crisis. The racial humiliation of the West is a necessary element of technocratic domination. Ruinous policies, with which we are all familiar, are inflicted upon the people and upon their lands. A vast propaganda machine is deployed in order to contain and deflect dissent, stoking internal conflicts. The sequence of subversion, corruption, and demoralization weakens and pacifies the native population, who are increasingly subjected to outright violence. This violence is delivered obliquely through client groups, for whom the regime creates extraordinary legal protections. It is in the face of such totality that fight or flight appears futile. Most simply freeze and await their turn. Those with the spirit to contest this state of affairs are presented with an incredible challenge: how to restore what has been destroyed, how to evade the trap that is closing, how, in short, to escape the frozen world. What we are faced with is an entropic force. The governing structure itself is extropic, that is to say that it represents a local decrease in entropy. This state is predicated on the aggregation of quantity through the industrial process, but this comes at the expense of quality. It is, as Evola says, a formless power, devoid of any real charisma. Form is broken down in order to release energy. This energy is used to break down further form. Thus the process is sustained through the consumption of limited capital reserves, natural capital, human capital, and civilizational capital. For us, the result is the same: relentless entropy. The parasite is killing its host. The dissolution of selected ethnic groups is only one aspect of the process by which the organic world is reduced to a state of managed equality. Entropy transcends the present order downwards, towards relative atomization and uniformity. It is the principle of repulsion, a cosmic exhalation by which things come apart. The primordial forest, in all its unfathomable complexity, is torn down and replaced with a managed monoculture. Light pollution imprisons the night sky. The connection between men and nature is interrupted. Visions of the divine, fleeting and tender, are engulfed by the deluge of raw information. Deprived of a sacred connection to the land and a pathway to the beyond, life fades away. Men are corralled into a spiritual monoculture of the lowest common denominator. A McDonald's on every street corner, a rainbow flag on every building, powerful tranquilizers, both digital and pharmaceutical, in every corporate citizen's pocket. Resistance to this downward spiral is, in essence, a rebellion against entropy itself. This may seem like an extraordinary claim. Entropy is, after all, the second law of thermodynamics. But as we stated above, the regime still frantically concentrates wealth and power at the top whilst dissolving everything below it. The voracious appetite of this formless mass cannot be satisfied forever. Energy rushes straight through it. In the grand scheme of things, it will not last long. Furthermore, the process entails an internal degradation of the participants, who exchange quality for quantity. But the point is made: local regions can temporarily reverse entropy. As such, an attempt at qualitative extropy may be undertaken. In fact, the present age of dissolution is an encouraging sign. Many times over, both on Earth and in the broader cosmos, things came together in this way. If they had not, there would be nothing to dissolve. But there exists an even more radical possibility, which must not be discounted, in spite of its boldness. The limited time horizons of men create a particular kind of illusion. Due to their fleeting nature, Men often mistake segments of cycles for eternal trends. The principle of extropy sits within a frame which assumes permanent entropy, because that is all that has ever been observed. But no one knows what has been forgotten. No one knows what possibilities remain unrealized. All anyone knows is what has been remembered and what is presently observed. To imagine that things will or can remain this way forever is to dream of the frozen world. Whilst cosmological entropy is perhaps our grandest physical observation, beneath it we see cycles occurring at every level of reality. In both instances, our evidence is partial, because we are partial. As such, a choice may be made as to whether we base our induction, ultimately, on physical observation or metaphysical principles. Either the universe will inexorably disintegrate into heat death, the perfect equality of the frozen world, sadly absent any modern egalitarians who may wish to enjoy the logical conclusions of their doctrine, or fundamental metaphysical principles will assert themselves, resulting in a reversal of polarities. For those with a temperament of the latter kind, it is not a particularly daunting leap of faith to suggest that the highest levels of being may also conform to the cyclical patterns observed below. If this is the case, then the grandest metaphysical cycle, the cycle upon which all of the myriad nested epicycles are anchored, will feature periods of global entropy and its reversal, a process of cosmic inhalation and exhalation recognized across traditional doctrines. In our desire to resist entropy, we have, therefore, two compatible models with which to work. One an actuality and one a possibility. Both are local or limited. Whilst the entropic flourish and the turn of the cycle invert the repulsive force of entropy, neither concludes with a permanent state of order. They represent, rather, the principle of attraction, a magnetism which brings things together. In the attempt to embody this principle, we manifest eros, in the higher form that Evola describes. Though most commonly represented, prosaically, at the level of sexuality and romance, eros transcends mere pleasure, or even the procreative drive, what Evola describes as the insignificant physical continuity of the species through the succession of perishable individuals, and relates rather to a union on a superior plane of being, a kind of divine aristocratic seduction, the basic metaphysical drive of the individual to overcome the divided and conditioned state in which he finds himself, in order to restore the absolute and primordial unity of his own being. I should make it clear that I am not critiquing procreation here, but rather arguing that it must be integrated into a transcendent purpose which we pursue, not just individually, but also as a group. We wish to become a vital and unified organism, not, as the regime desires, an aggregation of merely perishable individuals, atomized husks, stripped of all features not authorized or provided through technical means. Much as the individual yearns to deatomize himself through the pursuit of union on a higher plane, so may a people transcend the prosaic and the mundane. When we seek to differentiate our people, we must look further than basic biophysical or psychosocial similarity. These material aspects are necessary, but not sufficient, a state of affairs that can be demonstrated by the fact that many of the most enthusiastic enemies of the West are turncoats, or lobotomized janissaries. These mercenaries are biologically and culturally Western, but have chosen the side of those who wish to erase us. As such, they have surrendered a spiritual inheritance dating back millennia for a bag of silver and a few electronic trinkets. The trauma resulting from this lopsided transaction is projected onto those who have not capitulated, because, in the final analysis, we are differentiated by the higher expressions encapsulated in the racial spirit, the dialogue between the blood and the beyond. These qualitative elements are what make us unique, connect us to our land, in the sacred sense, and open a gateway to the higher planes of reality. They comprise a fundamental usness, which transcends the atomized individual, much as the individual transcends his divided and conditioned state, and which cannot be reduced to mere physicality. The destruction of these elements represents the most egregious form of racial vandalism perpetrated by the regime, because it has nothing of equivalent value with which to replace them. We have hinted here at two theatres of being, the internal and the external. The problem at hand has an internal and an external character. We observe the dissolution both within ourselves and without, and our proposed vectors of resistance, the entropic flourish and the turn of the cycle, reflect the relationship between these two theatres. The former has an internal character, and the latter external. Entropy occurs within a broader reality, which may itself be cyclical, and thus in a permanent state of oscillation between entropy and unity. For partial creatures such as ourselves, this relationship is fundamental to our experience of the world. Both are intimately connected. We are part of a whole, and we are parts of a whole. The individual seeks unity within himself. The individual seeks unity with that which is without himself. He seeks unity through himself and through his participation in the group, and then together, onwards and upwards, towards the veiled pinnacle of being. The nature of this superior domain is essentially unknowable to a partial entity. It is impossible to capture in its totality with the abstraction of mere words, no matter how poetic. The most skillful artists can, however, provide a glimpse through their work, itself an essentially devotional or exploratory activity. Contrast this attitude to that of modern scientists and experts in their quest for a theory of everything. These quants believe that everything can and must be made knowable, in the most reductive sense possible. They vivisect nature. They deanimate our world so that the life it once had may be permanently recorded in a debased quantitative form. Procrusteans of this variety would rather eliminate quality entirely than recognize that it cannot be represented in their spreadsheets. The spiritual poverty of most modern culture perfectly represents this degradation of the external world. We see it too in architecture and in the scouring of our sacred natural places. The degradation of the internal world is more insidious, but no less devastating. We are slowly eroded by industrial waste products. The food eats us. Endocrine disruptors accelerate the psychological disintegration provoked by a hostile cultural environment, with its limited spiritual horizons and its relentless regression towards lower activities. Dark practices result in addiction, weakening of the essence, and the coerced expenditure of energy. The modern Westerner has a head full of static. With his executive functions disabled, he gorges on his digital feed. He processes matter. He is a facility, a stomach wrapped in a protective duvet of fat, which acts as a pen to contain him. Every day he does battle with the state of nature. He has abandoned the wild tension of homeostasis and is instead regulated by increasingly intrusive and demeaning pharmaceutical interventions. From a moral perspective, these outcomes totally delegitimize the process of technocratic management, because the physical and spiritual condition of modern humans is so appalling. As Morgoth once said, if the modern world were a zoo, it would be shut down for animal cruelty. When resisting the degradation, there are thus two theatres of conflict, one in the internal world and one in the external. Both are intimately connected. Conditions in the external theatre affect conditions in the internal theatre, and vice versa. We seek reform of the external world for all of the reasons described above. We also recognise the extent to which corruption has entered the internal theatre through the subversive actions of the regime. As such, several strategies present themselves. Do nothing. Freeze. Obviously, the entire purpose of this work is to reveal that this is the condition under which most people operate, largely unwittingly, and that this state of mass helplessness greatly emboldens the regime in its program of dissolution. As such, we will reject this strategy at the outset. 1. contest the internal theatre, attempting an internal transformation. The aim of this strategy is to bring oneself together in the manner described by Evola. A secondary outcome of this strategy is that internal order will likely exert a similar influence on external reality. 2. Contest the external theatre, attempting a transformation of the external world. The aim of this strategy is to rearrange the external world into a condition of greater and/or increasing order. A secondary outcome of this strategy is that external order will likely exert a similar influence on internal reality. 3. Contest both theatres. Split one's efforts and attempt a simultaneous transformation of both domains. The emphasis on transformation is critical because the trap set forth at the outset of this work depends upon the maintenance of the existing frame. Within this frame, fight or flight is impossible, by design, for all of the reasons discussed so far. We might say that the techniques of fight or flight are inert, without the adoption of a transformative mode through which we may break out of the existing frame. Let us illustrate this point in detail through the example of untransformed fighting, although much the same critique could be made of untransformed flight. First, there is the problem of violence, which lies within the purview of the dominant power and its clients. As we demonstrated in the first installment of this series, the sovereign controls the violence. Unless one has accumulated enough strength to challenge the regime and prepared a viable alternative to the existing system of governance, irregular acts of violence are much more likely to strengthen the power structure than to weaken it. This being the case, it is unsurprising that the intelligence services have a history of provoking futile sacrifices of this kind, preying upon psychologically vulnerable individuals who are nowhere near worthy of the deed. Fortunately, few are foolhardy enough to entertain such suicidal fantasies. The majority are thus channeled into the diversions of mass democracy, or even worse, protest. We are trained to believe that these untransformed modes are the only legitimate avenues through which a just society may be realised. If we are to fight, it should be through democratic means, where every man holds his own small fragment of power. But the atomization of sovereignty, rather than its concentration, institutionalizes division. The social structure is divided against itself, rather than existing in a state of harmonious, differentiated unity, like a true organism. Of course, we are referring here to the proposed form of mass democracy, in which this atomized mass somehow arrives at robust and viable decision-making, whilst the institutions of power diligently enact the will of the people. In reality, the mass is ripe for exploitation through these institutions, which are controlled by a bureaucratic uniparty. Sovereignty is still concentrated. The regime distracts its subjects with a ritualized performative conflict called the election cycle, in which political characters execute a repertoire of set-piece battles. These battles inevitably result in ever more degraded appeals to the lowest common denominator, as the regime dissolves the social organism upon which it feeds. Genuine opposition is destroyed in its infancy by the media and the judiciary, who exist to protect democracy through the elimination of rivals to the incumbent ruling class. It is impossible to arrest the decline within the frame of mass democracy, which is both a product of and a catalyst for the decline. There is, as we say, no voting our way out of this. No historical counterfactual voting pattern in the post-war era would have resulted in anything significantly different from what we have now, because all of the candidates were approved, conditioned, or contained by the uniparty. As a technique for arresting the decline, mass democracy is dead on arrival, and it is thus futile to restrict ourselves to its doomed modalities, which aren't even democratic in any case. As such, we may liberate ourselves from the psychological confines of this tepid, equalitarian doctrine and pursue a more vigorous and authentic mode of being. We must transform and transcend our present circumstances. We must find a new mode within which the techniques of power acquisition are viable, The precise scheme of this transformation is a question that has vexed minds far superior to my own for millennia. That being the case, I will limit myself to a less granular response, derived from the broad implications of the themes discussed so far. What are the sorts of things we must do, rather than what are the exact things we must do? For my part, I will make the case for the prioritization of the internal transformation. This is not a novel perspective. Numerous historical thinkers have proposed the same thing. In our contemporary milieu, many have been inspired by these works. Examples include AA's concept of the network of tens, and the distributist mantra, kill the bug man within yourself. But the truth bears repeating, and I see the creation of this work as a part of the practice for which I advocate. I also believe that my low-resolution perspective, which emphasizes energy efficiency, is both highly practical and promotes unity of purpose amongst the various elements of the right. Waiting for the external world to change and make you a better man is passive. Attempting to rearrange this world from a degraded internal condition is hubristic and exposes a failure to comprehend the existing energy state. In order to impose one's will on the external world, one must have power, and power comes from the concentration of energy. Inside every one of us, there is an existential frontier. In order to contest this frontier, one must concentrate one's energy. In so doing, one begins to accumulate power. The internal transformation is a fight against the corruption and the dissolution within. The ugliness of the modern world is driven out through defiance, discipline, and courage. The internal transformation is an ascent away from technocratic servitude. It is a spiritual rebellion, a rejection of the paralyzing toxins that have been dripped into us since birth. Incrementally, and with great effort, one begins to manifest the perennial truth. One begins to display power over the humiliations of the modern world. This state of being is wildly attractive. It is inspirational rather than didactic. Telling the truth is powerful, but becoming the truth is even more so. The transformed man becomes a walking invitation to a better world. His case is made without effort and without argument. Whilst the agents of the regime suffocate beauty with their constant nagging, clucking like battery hens, the transformed man is dignified and noble, even in captivity, much like the horses to which I referred earlier, and he is primed for action in the external domain should the moment arise. The manual reassembly of the external world will require a monumental expenditure of energy. If the energy required is greater than the energy available, then it will not be possible. Therefore, it is in our interest to organize ourselves in such a way that energy accumulates around us without the expenditure of our existing reserves. This is the precise inversion of how the regime operates. At the most fundamental level of analysis, by performing the internal transformation, one begins to manifest the principle of attraction rather than the principle of repulsion. This is what it means to resist entropy, to grow. As such, one exudes passive magnetism. When attempting renewal or reconstruction, particularly within an entropic environment, passive magnetism, the ability to bring things together with minimal or no effort, radically shifts the energy calculation in a favourable direction and amplifies all effort expended. To put this idea in concrete terms, consider the archetype of the great leader, one whose passive magnetism is legendary, either gifted at birth or forged through struggle. See how the other men follow such a genius, a demigod who has given himself completely to the quest for unity on a higher plane of being. He does not need to waste his energy with tedious micromanagement. Such leaders look up and draw the world up with them by example. Our rulers look down and interfere in every aspect of our lives. Nothing scares them more than true greatness, because with this they cannot compete. In order to overcome this necrotic oligarchy, one requires a political strategy. The lessons of elite theory demonstrate that small, well-organized groups can displace existing power structures as long as they maintain iron discipline and a unity of purpose. These groups are concentrations of energy and, as such, possess power that may be exerted. This is a prerequisite for governance, which is incompatible with the dispersed energy of an unruly mass. Given our atomized state, we must start this process from scratch. In order to create such elite groups, one must populate them with elite individuals. This is not to say that no organization should be undertaken. On the contrary, the development of social and organizational skills is an important aspect of the internal transformation. But the ambitions of these organizations will be restricted by the quality of the constituent members. And, as we seek to contest the existing structure with a mode that exudes attraction rather than repulsion, the relentless striving for quality is imperative. Thus, the path of the internal transformation is a necessary precursor to the creation of viable political opposition. As these groups start to form, there will be conflict, because when things come together, collisions are inevitable. Certain tensions will always remain. This is the way of the organic, and we should not be too alarmed at such a state of affairs. The conception of the right as a static and homogeneous phenomenon is actually a reproduction of the atomized, equalitarian thinking which has brought us to where we are today. The antithesis of the modern world is an organic form, where differentiated elements of the structure move together for a shared higher purpose. Through the pursuit of this purpose, we may escape the precarious and barren existence imposed upon us, the frozen world. We must abandon the monoculture and become once again like a living forest, a celebration of the unmanageable concentration of energy, the robust harmonic tension upon which all beauty is predicated. Not all of the existing forms will survive the period of turmoil. We have already seen several dominant concepts fade or transfigure. What remains will settle into a self-stabilizing and creative tension, at least for the spring and summer of its life cycle. No one can predict the exact composition of the eventual organism, only that it will be organized, and that it will conform to certain key principles. The internal transformation should, therefore, be prioritized. We may not be able to divine the winning formula in its entirety, but we all know that it will never come about whilst we, as individuals, surrender to the many corruptions of the modern world. We must cease to be individuals divided against ourselves. We must draw together our various disparate aspects, atomized, tranquilized, and distracted as they presently are, and focus them with absolute intensity and unity of purpose. A single moment in this condition is worth more than an entire lifetime spent gorging on industrially manufactured slop. Battles won within sharpen the spirit. This spirit cuts through prosaic human concerns and drives itself ever upwards. It yearns for union and the concentration of energy. It seeks integration within a structure that exerts power upwards, not from the bottom, as in discredited egalitarian thinking, but from the top. This is the radical inversion that arrests the downward drawing world, a polar shift born of an aristocratic magnetism, which both reflects and results from the internal transformation. When this condition is realized, the pinnacle draws order upwards beneath it, as if in a wake, just as, through sheer will and personal magnetism, the great leader inspires his men to almost superhuman feats of self-overcoming. If it is hard to conceive of this today, it is because all we have ever known is the downward pressure of a bloated, descending elite, bent on dragging us down into the frozen world, bent on realizing the spiritual heat death of the West, the big longhouse at the end of time. What the regime fears more than anything else is the return of good men, acting with conviction and without hesitation. Men who do not freeze. Men who do not fall into the traps it has prepared. Men who could wipe, with a single stroke, all of its tedious, technocratic schemes from the board. With these men it cannot compete, and so it reverts to ugly subversions, provocations, and shrieks of victimhood. Over time, the fear has become an obsession. Today, in an attempt to prevent this eventuality, The power structure has totally mobilized against its most valuable human capital. The result is a deranged hostage situation in which our spiritually inert pathocracy clings onto power by erasing, systematically, its most technically gifted subjects, those who are required to maintain the managerial architecture. Meanwhile, it promotes, cultivates, and traffics in a great mass of dependence, a load which its critical systems can no longer handle with any degree of reliability. What we suffer under today is the most intolerant system of control ever devised. A single basic program for all peoples, absent distinction, beauty, or joy. A uniform mulatto noise devoid of a racial signal. The regime seeks a frozen world of permanent management where nothing ever changes, and it requires frozen, docile creatures to populate its dull stasis. But this stasis is a mirage, like a man in freefall who appears momentarily still as the ground approaches. We are well past the point where the illusion can be sustained. The decline is obvious, and is accelerating at an exponential rate. The entire monomaniacal endeavour will bring forth its precise inversion, a sudden, radical dynamism. And it is in this moment that the enclosure will open, momentarily, and allow the inhabitants to run free, their crushing obligations voided by circumstance. Those opposed to the regime may either initiate the moment of crisis, or capitalise upon it. In either case, they must embody an organic dynamism appropriate for the unfrozen world. To freeze is to accept on some level that one has become corrupted. Those who freeze know that they have not yet earned the right to respond with confidence. We must become worthy of acting with a fluency and a spontaneity which has been all but managed out of existence by the technocratic system. This means embodying the truth rather than launching volleys of hollow words from a position of obvious personal degradation. The medium is the message. Quiet, passive magnetism is the mode of resistance. Loud, active repulsion is for the agents of the regime. Resistance thus begins with the internal transformation, on territory not yet fully conquered, where one may convert the pressure to one's advantage, focusing energy against it and accumulating power in the darkness. The transformative mode renders the techniques of resistance once again viable. It is growth rather than decay, attraction rather than repulsion, and distinction rather than uniformity. This mode concentrates energy through passive magnetism. Those who adopt it assault the regime by the very fact of their existence, and may even win without having to fight in the external domain, the most energy-efficient victory possible. Should they have to fight, they will be sure that no better preparations could have been made. Unbreakable bonds will form between such men of quality, who will drive each other on, upwards, together. In this way, the people of the West can reclaim what has been taken from them by their traitorous ruling class. All around us are broken monuments to the glory of our ancestors. Only we can rebuild them, but to do that we must first rebuild ourselves. This work began with a dark story of submission, a story about a girl who froze. Recently, another friend told me a different story, one which may inspire us as we seek to escape the frozen world. He took me to a place near where he lives, a place where the local people still leave offerings on certain trees. He told me about the trees and why they were sacred. They were very old. So old, in fact, that one had finally fallen some time before, after a life spanning several hundred years. When this happened, the local woodsman, a veteran in his 80s, was asked by the estate manager to chop up the fallen tree, but had flatly refused. No explanation was forthcoming, and none was requested. In this place, the embers of the old world still burned, and the spirits warmed themselves in peace. The cousins of the fallen tree were also very old, and had become hollow over time. Some people said that they should be cut down for safety's sake, but my friend told me that when a tree hollows out and approaches its death, it can stand for decades, or even centuries. He said this as we looked inside a dark cavity. It was teeming with new life. Little green shoots, mushrooms, and insects going about their business, crawling over the damp moss and the lichen around a tiny pool. My friend told me that within the heart of an ancient tree, the forest is renewed.